Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 696, and today is October 23rd, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot to get through on today's show, so I'm going to run through the plugs real quick. Just want to remind people to share the show. It's hosted through the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the video version of the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. And of course, it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Also, follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_ for all the articles that I write or anything else I think is important. So that's a lot of what we talk about on this show. I will post on my Twitter feed, including this first article we have today. White House very close to finalizing Ukraine $20 billion loan. So the U.S. is close to an agreement with its NATO allies to provide Ukraine with a $50 billion loan that can be used to purchase more weapons. Washington will contribute the largest amount to the loan, $20 billion, and will use the interest from frozen Russian assets to repay the loan. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said Tuesday that, quote, "We're 99% there and it's nailing down to just a couple of relatively small things. We are very, very close." The U.S. will contribute $20 billion to the loan. The EU will collectively add $38 billion, with an additional $3 billion from the UK. For over a year, Washington has been conspiring with its NATO allies to use frozen Russian assets to loan Ukraine money. To repay the loan, the plan calls for using the interest generated off the roughly $200 billion in frozen Russian funds held in various Western countries. However, Washington only controls a small portion of the Russian funds, roughly $5 billion. That's been estimated as high as $6 billion, but the numbers I see are usually $5 billion, maybe $6 billion. So while the bulk is held by the European Union members, the EU's mechanism for keeping the Russian assets frozen needs to be renewed every 6 months, as the term of the loan will be a decade, if not longer. It's possible that the funds will be released prior to the loan being repaid. Still, Yellen said the White House is confident that the American taxpayer would not be left responsible for repaying the loan. Yellen said, "We have a high degree of confidence that the money will be there and remain locked down. We ask for some modest strengthening, but feel good that this is a secure loan that will be serviced by Russian assets, by Russia, and not by the American taxpayer." To alleviate the American concerns, members of the European Union want the body to extend the term of the frozen Russian funds from 6 months to 3 years. Hungary is suspending the European Union from making that decision until after the U.S. election next month. Yellen said the Biden administration is unconcerned with the potential ending of the sanctions because it is, quote, "inconceivable for any European Union member to terminate the penalties while Russia's invasion persists." And so, I think a lot of this is mostly self-described. I am surprised at how big of the chunk of this loan is coming from the U.S. Now, I mean, the U.S. has been giving the Ukraine, much more than any of its other allies have. And so in that sense, it's not surprising. But it is surprising because this was supposed to be interest off the frozen Russian loans. And so if most of the loans are held in European Union members, you would assume then that they're giving 90% or more, since we only hold a very small chunk of the frozen Russian assets. Obviously, if you're using interest off of $6 billion to repay a $20 billion loan, unless the terms of those, either the interest on the $6 billion, $5 billion is absolutely massive, or there's no interest being generated off the $20 billion loan, which I don't think is the case, then you're never going to be able to use that $5 billion to pay off the interest off the $5 billion to pay off the $20 billion. In fact, you're going to fall further and further and further and further behind. It's a debt trap. And so my guess is that eventually the American taxpayers do end up on the hook for a portion of this money. Now, only caveat to that, of course, is that the Russian funds remain frozen for decades. And I think that's the real concern here, that, maybe this is a real admission from the White House, although not directly, that they really do anticipate this war dragging out, not for years now, but for decades into the future. And of course, it seems really stupid to do this, right? Because $20 billion for the US, $38 billion for the European Union, $3 billion for the UK, those are significant chunks of money, and certainly things that will have enough money to probably create some political pressure in those countries. And so let's say the war in Ukraine is looking at coming to an end, and one of the things that these Western governments have to do in order to get Russia to stop its advance in Ukraine is to end the Western sanctions on Russia. Well, if they end the sanctions on Russia, then the assets are unfrozen and there will be no more interest to repay the loans, which means those taxpayers will be on the hook for the money. And I don't think taxpayers in those countries would be very happy with that. And so it's going to create a lot of political pressure to keep this war going. At the same time, $50 billion isn't a whole hell of a lot of money when it comes to Ukraine's needs in this war. And so, one could imagine that while this $50 billion loan may be a 3, 4, 5 month stopgap to plug some holes in the Ukrainian military, to put some funding where it's needed elsewhere in the Ukrainian government, it's not going to be a $50 billion loan that sustains Ukraine for the next decade. And so, I mean, this is like, buying a really expensive car that's, is going to need a huge amount of maintenance after a year, and you have no way to make the payments in the first place. I mean, this is an absolutely insane loan to put together. And, I think it's really about just getting Ukraine money in the most politically expedient way in these Western nations right now, which is to phrase this all as a loan and let the taxpayers be on the hook for it, 4, 8 years from now when whatever elected officials made these decisions are largely out of office. All right, next up, this one here from our friend Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com, October 21st, 2021. U.S. Canadian warships sailed through the Taiwan Strait. The U.S. and Canada each sent a warship through the Taiwan Strait on Sunday in a joint operation that came less than a week after the Chinese military conducted blockade drills around the island. The U.S. 7th Fleet said the guided missile destroyer, the USS Higgins, and the Canadian frigate, the HMCS Vancouver, made the transit. The U.S. framed the operation as, quote, routine, but Beijing always views the U.S. military activity in the sense of waterway as highly provocative. The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, said that the U.S. and Canadian warships disturbed the situation and undermined peace and stability. So Colonel Li Shi, a spokesperson of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, said the Chinese forces monitored the ships throughout the transit. So the U.S. frequently sails warships through the Taiwan Strait and has been encouraging its Western allies to join in on the provocations. Last month, German warships sailed through the sensitive waterway for the first time since 2002, which drew a sharp condemnation from Beijing. On October 14th, the PLA conducted drills simulating a blockade around Taiwan in response to a speech from the new Taiwanese president, where he said Taiwan, officially known as the Republic of China, would not be subordinate to mainland China, known as the People's Republic of China. The Chinese military also made clear the drills were a warning to the U.S. over its increasing support for Taiwan. The Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson said in a statement, relevant parties should cease supporting Taiwan independence and stop undermining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. China conducted its first blockade drill around Taiwan in August of 22 in response to then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi making a provocative visit to the island despite major protests from Beijing. The U.S. ignored China's concerns about Taiwan and continued to increase military and diplomatic support for the island. In September, President Biden approved a $567 million arms package for Taiwan. The U.S. military is openly planning for a war with China over Taiwan, despite the risk of any U.S.-China war turning nuclear. The U.S. Navy recently unveiled a plan to prepare its forces for a war with China by 2027. So things are still very concerning in the Asia Pacific, even if that really hasn't been much of the focus of the show over, especially, the past year with everything happening in the Middle East and Israel's just massacring people all over the place. All right, next up, we got my Libertarian Institute daily debrief from October 22nd. And this is essentially a full length article, so you may see it in the coming days at a few other libertarian foreign policy outlets, including antiwar.com. It's titled Joe Biden Allowed His Friend Bibi to Destroy His Presidency and Legacy. So in 2020, amid lockdowns, Joe Biden prevailed in the election, running his campaign from his home. Biden was clearly experiencing significant cognitive decline, so the American people were presented with a carefully choreographed message to vote for Biden, and that was Biden is a return to normalcy. Since Donald Trump descended the golden escalator, Americans were subject to a nonstop barrage from the establishment media and politicians, willing that we are in an existential battle for our country's soul. We were told that Russia had the election, Trump was Hitler, democracy was on the ballot, and the sitting president was bowing to dictators around the world. But Biden would save us. No more inflammatory rhetoric, no more prosecutions of the political opposition, and a more stable world. While Biden was never going to return the U.S. to a normal country in a normal time, he had potential to significantly de-escalate America's foreign entanglements. However, during his time in the Oval Office, 46 has done the opposite, starting wars and undermining international norms. Upon taking office, Biden had two easy foreign policy victories he could have secured. Firstly, the White House could have followed Trump's deal with the Taliban and exited Afghanistan in a coordinated manner in May of 2021. Rather, the White House mishandled the situation, first by pushing the exit from Afghanistan until September, which is the height of the Afghan fighting season. By then, the U.S.-built government in Kabul had collapsed. This chaos culminated in an ISIS-K bombing at the Kabul airport that killed hundreds of desperate Afghans and 13 U.S. soldiers. He also botched the Iran talks. So the other easy win for the new president was returning to the Iran nuclear deal. Negotiated during the Barack Obama administration, the deal implemented additional safeguards on Iran's civilian nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Tehran was entirely in compliance with the deal in May of 2018 when Trump unilaterally pulled out of the agreement at Tel Aviv's behest. Washington then placed crippling sanctions on Iran aimed at cutting the Islamic Republic's oil output to a minimum. Upon taking office, Biden could have easily negotiated with the moderate Iranian president Hassan Rouhani to return to the deal and lift sanctions. But the Biden team was determined to demand Tehran agree to a longer and stronger agreement, and at the same time looked the other way as Israel began attacking Iranian shipping and nuclear facilities. Over the following 2 years, U.S. and Iranian officials would engage in several rounds of indirect talks, while Israel continued to attack Iranian shipping and conducted sabotage and other assassinations inside of Iran. Under these conditions, a deal was never reached, and talks were abandoned last year. Pushing Tehran from the table and crippling economic sanctions on Iran had an important impact on Biden's Ukraine policy. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Washington and its NATO partners engaged in a two-front strategy to use Ukrainian soldiers to bleed and weaken the Russian invaders. The first was providing billions in weapons training and intelligence. The second was launching an economic war aimed to cripple the Russian economy and isolate Moscow and bring the Kremlin's war machine to a halt. However, as the Iran nuclear deal is what ostensibly tied Tehran to Western economies, once the war broke out, the Islamic Republic saw no downside to strengthening its ties with Moscow. Additionally, as is the case with Iran, Russia's main export is energy. The law of supply and demand says it would have been easier to push the Russian supply off the market if the U.S. was not attempting to simultaneously remove the Iranian oil supply as well. And we can also mention here Syria, Libya, Venezuela, and other instability that we have created around the region as other causes why there could be more oil on the market, and therefore it would have been easier to try to cut the Russian oil economy, which hasn't worked out so well. So after a few years out of power, Netanyahu returned to his post as Prime Minister of Israel, leading a far right-wing government in late 2022. That government included two extremist settlers in key positions who made clear a top priority was the annexation of the West Bank. That government ushered in a brutal regime for the Palestinians, with 2023 killings in the West Bank before October 7th reaching a multi-year high. Still, when Hamas broke the Israeli siege of Gaza on October 7th, the White House pretended that Israel had been a normal democracy, not a declared Jewish state with an apartheid oppression system directed at the native Arab population. The White House was a key amplifier of the atrocity propaganda put out by Tel Aviv following the Hamas attack. This gave Israel an unlimited blank check for killing in Gaza. Netanyahu has cashed in that check for $23 billion in military aid from the U.S., Washington's protection from UN resolutions at the Security Council, and the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, thousands of Lebanese civilians, and hundreds of Palestinians in the West Bank. The killing has intentionally targeted civilians and civilian targets such as hospitals, schools, shelters, and aid convoys. After each Israeli war crime, the U.S. State Department acts as an Israeli PR firm and insists the world must blame Hamas and not Israel for the killing. So one might ask, what happened to international law? So now President Biden has spent the final year of his presidency providing arms to Netanyahu so his government can commit war crimes every day. This is the same president who has insisted to every American that we must send nearly $200 billion to Ukraine to defend international law. If Russia was wrong to invade Ukraine, why can Israel invade Lebanon? If Russia is violating international law to extend its borders, why is Israel allowed to continue settlement expansion in the West Bank? If Russia was wrong to detain American journalists in Russia, why has Israel been allowed to kill at least 170 Palestinian journalists, including Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen? If Russia was wrong to attack civilian targets in Ukraine, why has Israel been allowed to destroy nearly every school, hospital, and shelter in Gaza? One could go on at length, citing a myriad of hypotheses intrinsic to Biden's murderous foreign policy. When it comes to starving the people of Gaza, assassinations in Iran, bombing diplomat facilities in Syria, and attacking UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, it's clear that Netanyahu wipes his ass with the international rules-based order that Joe Biden claims to love so much on a daily basis. Currently, Americans care more about domestic issues, but history will evaluate Biden by his elective and catastrophic wars. The X-rays of Israeli bullets lodged into the brains of the Palestinians' preteen children will define the legacy of Biden and his good pal Bibi during the coming decades. So, yeah, that was my Libertarian Institute email yesterday. If you want to sign up for that, you can subscribe at the Libertarian Institute. A couple more stories in the news here. Netanyahu and Blinkin discuss uniting against Iran. This one from Dave DeCamp, October 27th or October 22nd. Today is the 23rd, so it can't be the 27th yet. And it was published at antiwar.com. So Dave writes, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem on Tuesday and discussed uniting against Iran. So Netanyahu's office said in a statement on the meeting, the issue of Iranian threat was raised, including the need for both countries to unite against it. The Prime Minister thanked the American Secretary of State for the support of the U.S. in the fight against Iran's axis of evil and terrorism. The State Department said in a readout of the meeting that the two officials discussed efforts to further regional aggression from Iran and to deter further regional aggression from Iran and its proxies, and reaffirmed the United States' ironclad commitment to Israeli security. The meeting comes amid anticipation of an Israeli attack on Iran in response to the Iranian missile barrage that was fired at Israeli territory, which was retaliation for a string of Israeli escalations, including the killing of Hamas's political chief Ismail Haniyeh while he was visiting Tehran. It is unclear how big Israel's attack on Iran will be or when it will happen, but is expected to take place before the U.S. presidential election on November 5th. According to Israeli media, Israel could use a Hezbollah drone Israel could use a Hezbollah drone attack that targeted Netanyahu's home as a pretext to justify more extensive strikes on Iran. Iran has denied any role in the attack on Netanyahu's home, which was officially claimed by Hezbollah on Tuesday. Blinkin and Netanyahu discussed the attack during their meeting, according to the statement from Netanyahu's office, which made clear that Israel is still blaming the incident on Iran. So the statement said, the American Secretary of State expressed the U.S.'s deep shock over the Iranian attack via Hezbollah to eliminate the Prime Minister of Israel, and made clear that this was an exceptionally extreme incident. The U.S. is supporting Israel's planned to attack Iran by vowing to defend Israel from any retaliation, and has already deployed a THAAD air defense system and about 100 troops to Israel to help with that attack. Now, let's talk about how Iran is feeling about the potential attack. IranianRGC Commander downplays threat of Israeli attack. So a senior member of the IRGC on Tuesday downplayed the threat of an Israeli attack on Iran, saying any operations would likely be limited. So according to this is Major General Mohammed Ali Jafari, who was the top commander of the IRGC from 2007 to 2019. He said, I assure the Iranian people with certainty that the Zionists will not undertake any significant or substantial action. Whatever they do will be nothing more than a desperate attempt. The Zionist regime may carry out a desperate, limited, minor attack, but insisted they definitely could not carry out operations on the scale of Iran's October 1st attack on Israel, which came in response to a series of Israeli escalations in the region. I'm not sure if this is like maybe a statement just to tamp down fears in Iran, or if Tehran maybe feels they have some indication of what Israel is planning to do in their attack, and they really don't think it's going to be that significant of an attack. We will see in the coming days. I'm not sure if I agree with this Iranian general that Israel is going to do something smaller than what Iran did on October 1st. All right, so now let's get back to that Antony Blinken meeting with Netanyahu. So this again from Dave DeCamp. Netanyahu declines Blinken's request to publicly reject Gaza ethnic cleansing plan. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his aides rejected a request from Secretary of State Antony Blinken to publicly say that Israel is not implementing an ethnic cleansing plan in northern Gaza known as the General Plan. So the report from the Washington Post said Netanyahu and his top aide Ron Dermer told Blinken that the general's plan was absolutely not our policy and that the perception had been deeply damaging to us, but when asked to state publicly, they declined. The Times of Israel also reported that Netanyahu rejected the request to publicly denounce the ethnic cleansing plan. And so this is really strange, right? If somebody is saying that you're going to murder someone and your lawyer says, hey man, you should just say you're not going to murder that person. You say, well, I'm not going to say that. Then, people are going to think that you might want to murder that person. So, it's pretty shocking that they won't say that they're not going to commit a genocide. So while Israeli officials had told the U.S. that they're not carrying out the ethnic cleansing plan, Israeli soldiers told Haaretz last week that it's already underway in northern Gaza, where Israel has ordered hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee south and will impose a full siege. And we have seen some very disturbing videos of Palestinians being rounded up, the men being separated from the women and children. And when you say men, we're talking about anybody who could grow a mustache, which means 13, 14 years old, maybe a 12-year-old who hit puberty a little early. Of course, the kids of Gaza could be going through puberty a little bit early just because of the intense killing and bombardment over the past year, which, just physiologically can sometimes push people into going through puberty early. So that may be something that's happening quite a bit in Gaza. And so there might be a lot of these little kids growing mustaches and stuff like that, and then being lined up with the men and taken to God knows where. hopefully they're not just being killed somewhere in Gaza. But if not, we know a lot of these men have been taken to Israeli torture prisons, and many of them killed there. If not, have had their lives absolutely decimated by the torture they were put under by the Israelis. And of course, it's not just that we had some soldiers tell an Israeli outlet that this was underway and that they were enacting this. We also had a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, May Golan, and a member of Netanyahu's government, Itamar Ben-Gvir, both say that they would like to carry out an ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And so I think that the evidence is pretty strong that that is what they're planning. All right, this next one here is a quote I found in CNN. So Israeli soldier admits to running over hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza. So in an article about the psychological trauma endured by Israeli soldiers, CNN quotes a member of the IDF who says he ran over hundreds of Palestinians, including many were still living. So this is the former soldier has spoken publicly about the psychological trauma endured by Israeli troops in Gaza. In testimony to the Knesset in June, he said that on many occasions, soldiers had to run over terrorists that are alive in the hundreds. He described the scenes and how gruesome that was. But so first of all, this is evidence of war crimes, right? They say we ran over terrorists, but they ran over Palestinians. They didn't get out and check who they were running over. And I'm sure many of these people were children. We have seen, videos and images of Palestinians who were run over by tanks in Gaza, and how just absolutely disgusting. That was something that apparently the Soviets had done during their occupation of Afghanistan, as being a particularly cruel treatment in way they killed the native Afghans. And so that Israel is running over the bodies of Palestinians and tanks, and I'm sure Humvees and other stuff as well, is just deeply, deeply disturbing. And this is, of course, evidence of a war crime. But how this evidence of a war crime is presented to the Americans isn't, look at what's happening to the Palestinians. It's this poor Israeli soldier had to endure this because Hamas, right? Like it's all, they had to run over the terrorists. They had no other options here. And so this poor Israeli soldier is now inflicted with psychological trauma. Just absolutely disgusting. All right, next up here, Israeli military kills 115 Palestinians in Gaza over a 48-hour period. So Gaza's health ministry said Tuesday that Israeli forces killed at least 115 Palestinians and wounded nearly 500 others in the previous 48-hour period. The latest violence brings the total of from the Gaza Health Ministry, the death count to 42,718, and the number of wounded to over 100,000 at 100,282. The numbers, of course, don't account for the Palestinians who are missing and presumed dead under the rubble. Also, anybody who was, say, run over by an Israeli tank on the side of the road and their remains never showed up at a hospital or a morgue, or the many Palestinians who were gunned down in the street by the Israelis and they're buried in shallow graves by the Israeli military. The Israeli military continued its heavy attacks on northern Gaza, whereas it attempted to carry out an ethnic cleansing plan known as the General's Plan to force hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to flee south under threat of death or by military action or starvation. So the Israeli assault in northern Gaza has been focused on the Jabalia refugee camp, where the Palestinian news agency Wafa reported at least 8 Palestinians were killed by Israeli shelling on Tuesday. Wafa also reported that 15 Palestinians, including women and children, were killed by Israeli attacks on the town of Beit Lahana in northern Gaza. In southern Gaza, Israeli forces bombed a house near Rafah, killing at least 4 Palestinians. All right, the last article I have here today, this one talks about what's happening in Lebanon. Journalists find no evidence of Israeli claim that Hezbollah money stashed under Beirut hospital. So journalists were given unrestricted access to the Salah General Hospital in Beirut's southern suburbs after the Israeli military claimed Hezbollah money and gold stash was hidden in a bunker beneath the building. A BBC journalist, and I also saw a Sky News journalist, reporting from the hospital's basement level, said the staff opened any doors and cabinets the reporters wanted to open. Journalists were also available to explore anywhere in the building on their own, and saw no evidence of any Hezbollah money stashed anywhere. Israel first made the claim in a video on Monday night, prompting the hospital to evacuate patients over fears it would be bombed. We were at a hospital working, treating patients, and then the video came out. Obviously, we have been living in terror for the past 24 hours. In response to the press access to the hospital, the Israeli military claimed the entrance to the bunker was an adjacent building. According to the National, journalists accessed the building and saw a parking bay with empty boxes and 2 locked doors. According to DW, the owner of the hospital is a member of the Lebanese parliament and has strongly denied the Israeli claims and invited Lebanese military and UN peacekeepers to tour the hospital. The hospital is located in a southern suburb of Beirut, which has been flattened by heavy Israeli airstrikes. On Monday, Israeli strikes hit near another hospital in Beirut, killing at least 18 people, including 4 children. And of course, one of the reasons this story is so important is we haven't had this kind of access in Gaza, right? The international media hasn't been able to come in and tour all these hospitals, all these schools, all these shelters that Netanyahu keeps saying are Hamas command and control facilities. So Israel has no choice but to attack them. Well, this is another example of them claiming that this is a military facility, and when international journalists get to view it, that's not the case. This has happened in Gaza too. There's been limited access. There was a CNN reporter who was able to go in and tour a cemetery and was not presented by Israel with the evidence that proved that the cemetery was actually being used by Hamas to carry out attacks. Whatever evidence that we've found from the Al-Shifa hospital turned out to not have been the Hamas command and control center. So this evidence just kind of builds and shows that the Israelis are lying and that they're just attacking civilian targets and committing war crimes because the U.S. allows them to do it. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. More tomorrow.